In this chapter, we're going to look at issues of security with relation to MySQL. To begin with, we're going to examine MySQL's system of privileges, whereby the different users that are stored in the MySQL database can be granted and revoked certain privileges with greater or lesser levels of permission. We'll also learn to use the MySQL database directly where all this information is stored. Then we'll look at the different ways we can encrypt data within MySQL using both one-way and two-way encryption, and also the specific password function that is used to protect passwords stored in the MySQL database. Now let's take a look at the privileges system we use within MySQL. When we log on to MySQL, we can choose to log on with a specific username. So in this case, we're choosing to log on as root. I have elected not to put a password on the root user. This would be a very bad idea if this database were going to be accessible from the web. It's always a good idea to include passwords on all of your MySQL users. Let's go into MySQL and we're going to see how we can create a user and give certain privileges to that user. The command we use is the grant command, and the syntax runs something like this. We use the command grant, and then we specify exactly what kind of privileges we want to grant to this user. So we can grant them select privileges to carry out select queries, or we can grant them perhaps select and insert privileges. This will allow them to look at the data, add new data, but not to modify any existing data or delete data. We could allow them to modify, but not to delete. Let's say just for now that we just grant them to read the data, but not make any changes to it. Then we need to specify to which table we are granting them access. We can specify *.* If you've used the Microsoft Disk operating system, then this command will be familiar to you, or this syntax I should say. What it essentially means is everything before the wildcard before the dot and wildcard after the dot. In fact, anything at all. So what we're saying in this case is any database and any table. So this grants reading privileges to all the databases on the MySQL system and all the tables within all those databases. For this example though, let's just grant them read permissions simply on all the tables within the sample database. And we're going to call this user reader. And so we simply say to and then a username, and we can specify a host if we want after the username, separated by an @ sign. We're going to specify that this is reader at localhost to make sure that the only place reader is going to be able to log in from is from this particular machine and not from the web. Finally, we can specify a password. In this case, I'm making the password secret. This is a very bad name for a password, as it's very obvious to guess. But for the sake of an example, it's fine. Now that we've added our user, if we grant these privileges to a user that doesn't exist yet, MySQL will automatically create the user for us, in this case reader at localhost. Now we can exit MySQL and let's go back in as reader, I beg your pardon. When we enter this from the command line prompt, we get prompted for the password. We type in our password and we're granted access to the well, we can see all the databases here, so are we granted access to all the databases? Let's try using the food database. We get a nasty error message saying that we're not allowed to look at the food database. We can see that it's there, but we can't touch. Let's go into sample. Now we can see in sample, that's because we've been granted privileges for all the tables within sample. So let's try a select query on orders. That works. Let's try deleting all the data within orders. That doesn't work. Once again, the delete command has been denied because we weren't allowed to use the delete command anywhere within the system. That's because when we granted ourselves a privilege as the root user, we only specified select and not delete. Let's try update orders table, set total equals 0. Once again we get another error. If we want to see exactly what privileges we have, we can just say show grants for, and then our username and the host, if that host has been specified in the original grant command. Because the screen size is quite small for the purposes of making this movie, the results of the show grants query are slightly broken up, but you can read them still with a little effort. As we can see, usage on everything, but select on only the sample database. Usage simply means that we can enter the database system, I should say. As you can see, the password that's shown there is pretty unintelligible. So if someone came and looked over our shoulder, or we went away for a coffee break for 5 minutes and they tried to come and look at our password to see if they could use that later, they wouldn't be able to access that. Similarly, as we'll see in a later movie within this chapter, the data for the passwords is stored similarly encrypted. We're going to look at that in a later movie. In our next movie, we're going to take a look in some more detail at the privileges system.